So I wanted to give my 2 cents on the recent statement Trump made at Mar-a-Lago about the Ukraine war. And a couple of things I wanted to focus on. One, basically the way he threw Ukraine under the bus. But one other thing, his mantra of the war would never have happened if I were president. For years, he's been repeating the war would never have happened if I were president.
It's a senseless war. It should have never happened, would have never happened if I was president.
He said that so many times, even Vladimir Putin repeated it. And here, less than a month ago, Putin repeated Trump's mantra, where he said, I couldn't disagree with him that if he had been president, if they hadn't stolen victory from him in 2020, the crisis that emerged in Ukraine in 2022 could have been avoided. Putin repeating Trump's mantra. What does it mean now that Trump is president? Well, for Ukraine, we see that means that he's throwing Ukraine under the bus.
And I think I have the power to end this war. And I think it's going very well. But today I heard, oh, well, we weren't invited. Well, you've been there for 3 years. You should have ended it 3 years. You should have never started it. You could have made a deal. I could have made a deal for Ukraine that would have given them almost all of the land, everything, almost all of the land, and no people would have been killed, and no city would have been demolished, and not one dome would have been knocked down. But they chose not to do it that way.
Almost all of the land, he says, which I guess in this speech is his funky way of saying that Ukraine would have to give up some territory, make territorial concessions. If he had been president back then, when this war would have never started if he had been president. So for Ukraine, give up land, then, now.
A deal. I could have made a deal for Ukraine that would have given them almost all of the land, everything, almost all of the land, and no people would have been killed, and no city would have been demolished, and not one dome would have been knocked down.
So basically, if he had been president, give up territory, make territorial concessions, you would avoid death and destruction. So what does that mean for the rest of Europe? More specifically, what does it mean to the former Soviet republics? Because it's looking to me like if Putin's ready to make a move, perhaps make the same demands of Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, etc., as he's making on Ukraine, then Donald Trump, now that he is president, none of this wouldn't have happened if I had been president. Now that he's president, he can broker a deal to avoid death and destruction and the knockdown domes if they just make territorial concessions. Give up some territory, or as he says, almost all of the land. So that kind of puts Europe, actually all the former Soviet republics, at a fork in the road, crossroads. On the flip side, the Russian Federation is on the brink of collapse. So Putin is in no position to invade another country, especially a NATO one, or open another front. And it isn't just these numbers that show where Russia's at. It's so many other factors: sanctions, inflation, interest rates, lack of manpower, the steel industry starting to be targeted by drones, and most importantly, the oil industry, Russia's oil industry being taken offline, being knocked out, which is the right thing to do. Now, for Russia to be able to recover from this will take a long time. And how do we know this? That's basically because of how they nationalized all of the assets in Russia, seized, sold, took, and not just the oil industry, a whole lot of other industries. But the most important one is the oil industry. And when it was nationalized, what happened with Venezuela when they nationalized the oil industry? Okay, they pretty much, regardless of sanctions, haven't been able to recover since the 70s because all those companies that they screwed over hesitate to go back and get screwed over again. It's the same thing with Russia. The corporations that they stole from, that they seized, that they confiscated, property, assets, they're going to hesitate to go back to Russia. So for them to recover is going to take a very long time. Now, despite the Russian Federation being on the brink of collapse, there are a couple of rubs, of course. One being Russia's propaganda machine. They have one heck of a propaganda machine, complete with bot farms, troll farms. It's impressive. So, should Putin project strength, threatening to invade, along with Trump negotiating, making a deal for almost all of the land between Russian propaganda, state propaganda, troll farms, bot farms, Elon Musk, Twitter, right-wing media, MAGA, conservative media, between all of them, they can easily, well, they can just flood everything to discourage dissent, break down Europe's morale, things like that. So that's one thing to be mindful of. And then there's another one. And here is the other rub: the billionaire class, the oligarchs, the globalists, tech bros, whatever you want to call them. Anyways, judging by the amount of billionaires at Trump's inauguration, the amount of billionaires in Trump's administration, it's pretty safe to say that Trump is in bed with billionaires. The Rupert Murdoch, how many of his people, his box people, are in Trump's cabinet administration. So even though the Russian Federation is on the brink of collapse, there's a possibility that it could be saved if these billionaires can get together and save it. And when Trump is asked about his phone calls with Putin, he just responds with, I don't want to say. I don't want to say. Okay, so there's obviously something nefarious going on. And I don't trust this administration's billionaire class, these oligarchs. So Europe and Ukraine really need to concentrate on decimating Russia's economy, especially their oil industry, not just for now, but so that it could take decades to recover. And in the meantime, slowly reform the country, whatever new nation comes out, through slowly lifting sanctions, maybe some financial relief type of things, in exchange for reforms. Yeah, Europe, especially Ukraine, the former Soviet republics, your only goal should be to give Russia a humiliating defeat, economically and on the battlefield. Glory to Ukraine.